I'll officially call this meeting to order at 4:33 on Monday, 9/21. Thank you all for joining us. We do have the opportunity to have public audience at all Board of Selectmen subcommittee meetings. Maria, Melissa, do we have any public audience? I didn't see any comment come in. All right, for the folks at home, same process. If you do want to comment on specifics around the Parks and Rec Special Revenue Fund analysis, please do send those to the town clerk as per our regular process for the Board of Selectmen. All right, so let's jump right into it. We're obviously here to see if we can, I hate to say the word finally, but finally put to rest, how do we treat this fund? Do we continue to have this fund? How do we make allocations within this or to this fund? We can certainly talk about costs and rates. My personal preference, and again, this is just my preference, is we've spent a substantial amount of time in the last 5 years talking about where we can chip, where we can cut. Not saying that any of that is off the table, but a lot of that work has been done. So I would like to talk about, if we could, the substance of how we're going to deal with this fund overall versus the $5,000 and $10,000 items, at least initially. Amy, Maria, Melissa, other thoughts, comments before I turn over the rest of the group?
No, just, in terms of the analysis that staff put together, I really wanted to commend Tom and Amy and Melissa for their hard work on it. I really felt like what they pulled together for us kind of gets at the heart of some of the systemic causes, I think, of why we are consistently seeing some of the deficits. I know that we were able to implement, some potential recommended measures, such as reducing staffing, which did help us bring us, much closer to breaking even this past year. But again, really wanted to recognize, again, the work that Melissa, Tom, and Amy did on pulling this together for us. And in terms of, Sean, how you think it would be best to proceed, if you think it would be helpful for us to, go through the recommendation section with you all or just take questions, we're here for you guys, however you'd like to proceed.
I think if you guys want to give us the 5 to 10 minute on this, I think that'd be appropriate. As long as others on the phone concur. I did read through it, but I think it's important that we just share the high level.
Yeah, I've read it, but for anybody watching who hasn't read it, that might be a good idea.
Let's not make this a Tom Roy presentation, though.
Hey guys, Chris is here.
Hey, Chris. We're going through the analysis in about 5 or 10 minutes here. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So maybe I'll start out with item number 1 and then just ask everybody else to jump in terms of the recommendations from our findings and analysis. But, at a staff level, we thought for streamlining and transparency purposes that it really made sense to pursue accounting for Parks and Recreation in one location and really thinking of it as the larger Parks and Recreation department. And we could really do it a number of ways. We had some former Board of Selectmen members who had a desire to see it accounted for all in the general fund. We had some recommend, and our initial thought at a staff level was account for everything in the special revenue fund and just show a transfer coming in for the Parks division that's currently funded by the general fund. Another alternative, we know that there was some desire, again, from folks to account for everything in the general fund, but perhaps separate out the golf course. So there really are a number of ways that we could accomplish this. But again, I think for transparency purposes, we felt that being able to, again, look at the department as a whole and account for the department in one location made a lot of sense. And you may recall 2 budget seasons ago, I think Amy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we did account for this 2 or 3 different ways. Would you mind sharing some of the different ways we ran the numbers?
Yeah, sure. So first we put everything into the general fund, and then we didn't have to worry about any transfer from the general fund into the Simsbury Farms fund. And then in the next turn we moved, no, I'm sorry, the first time we put everything into the Simsbury Farms fund. And then we in turn moved everything out of the Simsbury Farms Fund and put everything into the general fund. And then at the end of the day, we ended up keeping it segregated between the two funds.
And again, there really is no, I think of these three options, there's not a wrong way to do it. Again, I think we just need some direction from our policy leaders in terms of what are you more comfortable with? Because again, as Amy showed 2 budget cycles ago, we can account for it in any of these methods. It's just what are you most comfortable with?
Yep. So just a quick history from that. We did debate doing just that a number of years ago when Rob was on this committee with us, right, Jerry?
Yep.
And Dave. And one of the pushbacks was that because the fund was variable or unpredictable, you're essentially passing along a tax increase, and it's just a matter of timing. But by truing the fund up, you know, at the time I think it was $200,000-$300,000, right? And the concept that was discussed was that had to come from the taxpayers at the time, and ultimately it did when there was a transfer. But it was a matter of, did it come out of reserves or did it come out of budgeting? And that was something. So not, and again, Amy, if I'm off the reservation on this, let me know, but make sure that, you know, if we're just going to put it in the revenue fund, you know, there does need to be a true up, and that the taxpayers, one way or another, either at the end of the year or during the year when we budget, do have to pay for this, right? If there's
my issue is, if I can jump in, Sean.
Yep.
It has always been that it's a matter of transparency.
Yep.
With the vagaries of weather and everything. Yeah, the problem always been to upfront make the fund look like it's going to break even. And you know what your basically you know what your expenses are, and all of a sudden you got to make up revenue to make sure that it is neutral. And sooner or later, the taxpayers are going to pay for it, whether it's upfront or in the back end. And I think it's always not been fair to the taxpayers nor to the fund itself. The fact that it's always ended up in the back end being trued up, as opposed to letting people know right up front that there's going to be variances in revenue due to weather. And that's the problem that I've always had, is you can't look at recreation as a business. You could look at the golf course as a business, but you can't put pools, you can't put the rink and stuff like that as a business. It is a community function. And I think that's where the town has fallen down in terms of its support for recreation.
Can I ask a couple clarifying questions?
Sure.
So just, I'm sorry, Linda, if I was talking.
Of the report and have everybody's faces so we can actually see who's trying to talk. I don't think we need to look at, right now we just have this shared screen of there, we have our.
Okay, so there's 3 questions. And first to Jerry or Sean, just one quick question. You use Jerry answers, but you said that it's variable. Clarifying the variability is the ebb and flow of revenue from various usage fees. Is that correct? That's correct. The variable. Just for clarity there. Okay. Yep. And then Sean, you referenced this committee, this group, or similar, pardon me, convened last time.
This is the 3rd iteration of the group.
Okay, so in each so this 3.0, just for historical purposes, the first time it was convened and the second time it was convened, was the accounting the same as it is today? And the decision was from both of those to keep it as is? Or did the first time, did it move it out of general into this format, and then second, confirm keeping it as this format?
The first one.
There were 2 items in the first iteration that occurred. One of which is there was a reinstitution of general fund funding into the fund.
Yep.
You go back to the original fund back in 1999, the general fund would support the revenue fund to the tune of $65,000 a year.
Yep.
When, in 2011, I believe it is, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, they took out the funding and then pumped up significant numbers of expenses in terms of the director's salary and a bunch of other fixed costs into the fund. And all of a sudden we went from $150,000 surplus at the end of 2010 to all of a sudden within 2 years, we started showing large deficits. So that's sort of the history. The second item that occurred in that, out of that first group was we took the golf course capital non-recurring items out of the general fund and we established the surcharge for golf course equipment as an added fee to the golfers. So that, your father really loved that one, Sean, taking something out of CNR. And he soaked that one up.
Oh, I remember. He called me on it the other day.
But those were the two items that occurred. And Sean, you are correct in terms of it. It was a political decision not to make any modifications because all of a sudden you'd see a $300,000 addition to the general fund from Culture, Parks, and Recreation.
Yep.
Can I
just one more point just to add to that with Jerry? We also were exploring whether an enterprise fund was a good idea last time or not.
For the golf course specifically, correct.
Right. And that was not recommended to come back
at that time, correct.
So can I just ask, the last time this work group was convened to consider likely these same issues, was number one was the structure of the two funds the same as it is today? I mean, the structure.
I'll save you a little bit, Chris. Nothing changed as a result of the second.
Okay,
meeting.
Great. Okay, so then
particularly because we had changes both politically and in terms of upcoming changes in management for the town.
Okay, I just needed that just for level setting purposes.
Yep.
The last question goes to Maria and Amy, I'm sure you've done some research. It's tough to consider peer towns because I'm not aware of ones of same size that operate a golf course. Certainly peer towns have other various Parks and Rec assets, but from your experience and talking to your peers from the perspective of financial management, how would you say, or where have you viewed other towns, how that they approach this issue structurally?
There's a lot of research on that in the report in the past.
Yeah, I'm curious as to what because Maria's she's come in and she's got a different viewpoints on a lot of things, how Simsbury is running itself, so to speak. And I'm wondering, relative to how they view, what is their position on this? You get the recommendations of the possibilities, but when you talk to peers, if you haven't, that's fine, we can move on. I'm just curious.
No, that's okay. And actually, I think that really might segue very nicely into sort of the second piece of our recommendations, which was this discussion around essentially what are characterized as community use expenditures being picked up by the user fees as opposed to through the tax base. And then, that really was, how much of a general fund contribution to help support the overall administration of the department, utilities, things of that nature. And I think Tom's benchmarking really showed this, and it's been my experience in the past, and I'll kind of come back to that in a moment, but typically you will see most communities who are similar in size to us or similar structure, that the general fund does view it as a community service, similar to a senior center or similar to a library, and that the general fund typically does pick up a much larger portion of supporting, again, community use expenditures, overall administrative expenditures. I know that Chris and Sean know this about my background, but I actually sort of lived this very similar experience in my last community. When the community center building was built in the early 2000s, they shifted everything over to a special revenue fund. And the thought was that all the user fees will pick up essentially all the costs, that there would be very minimal general fund contribution. And sure enough, within about a 2 to 3 year period, this happened prior to my arrival, the fund was running at a very, very significant deficit year over year. And so when we did a similar analysis, it was, okay, really there are a lot of community expenditures, whether it's, you know, utilities, salary and benefits of the director of the overall department, you know, how much of that should the general fund really be picking up as opposed to user fees subsidizing those expenses through their program fees. And so I think we're finding ourselves in a very similar situation here. I don't think that that's a sustainable model to expect that, let's say, again, all of the recreation program fees are somehow going to also cover utilities, cover building maintenance, cover, you know, administrative salaries. And just a good example of that was right here this past fiscal year. We came really close to breaking even. We were within about 15,000 of breaking even. Again, we did have to make that really difficult staffing decision to lay off. And the difference between breaking even or not was the mechanical failure we had of the ice rink boiler. And so initially the revenue fund picked that up. And that was something that if that had happened at the library, if that had happened at Eno, if that had happened at town hall, that's just part of our infrastructure. And ordinarily the general fund takes care of our buildings, our brick and mortar. But with the way that this was set up many, many years ago, the revenue fund and our participant fees have been picking up those kinds of expenses. And so I think that's a really good example of an expense that we would have argued and did argue that, you know, paying for a mechanical, you know, boiler at an ice rink, that's not something that should necessarily be fully borne by our program users. And I think that's just a really good, very recent example.
Maria, just to finish this thread, but how did that prior analysis overlay with those that were making money using the town facilities? Because to me, that feels like a different dynamic here. Is that we've got a whole bunch of contractors that come in that use our facilities. Mm-hmm. They get paid to do so through user fees. And my concern is are we collecting enough from the allocation of the wear and tear on our facilities? Because the taxpayers did pay for that building, and I don't think they had the intention of letting someone else make money on that. And then the follow-up to that, and Linda, I know I promised you next, I will, is no one else has a golf course but us. Right?
Not true.
West Hartford.
Glastonbury. West Hartford, is it Manchester? There are a few, right?
Glastonbury, Windbury,
West Hartford's revenue fund is in the same
Bloomfield.
situation that we're in. And,
West Hartford does?
If you look at the benchmarking, yes, and Buena Vista as well. So they actually have two, well, 1.5. But they're in the same boat we are with we're the only towns that absorb all of those costs into our revenue funds. And if you look at the benchmarking, West Hartford is the one that's in the same situation as Simsbury. The other towns where those facility fees haven't been added to the revenue fund and the benefits and salaries for their programmers, they're sustainable funds. West Hartford.
I'm not talking about the salaries and allocation. I'm talking about the fact that there's a golf course. So we can debate the load, but some of your job is dealing with the golf course.
Correct.
Right. So, you know, we fought time and time again in the past that there should be no allocation for the golf course, and I stand firmly against that. That is, if your time is being used there, then we got to get this right. And the problem is that we all sit around and fight with each other over 10% or 25% or 75% or 50%. And it's a mess.
And so, that will always happen so long as you have a revenue fund.
Yeah, I agree. Linda.
Okay, I have several things to say, so bear with me. But so yes, this is like the third time. I think I was only on the second, not the first. And the big thing that I remember was that we did nothing. It wasn't that we made recommendations. It just sort of dissolved into nothingness. And as somebody pointed out earlier, that's because of the difficulty of reallocating expenditures in a more appropriate way because of the impact on the general fund. You know, the reason that things were, and I would use the word inappropriately, allocated to the Simsbury Farms Fund was political, and to get it out of, so that it wouldn't create a tax increase. So for those of you who aren't on the Board of Finance, it's not as simple as, hey, the taxpayer is going to pay for it one way or the other, whether it's upfront or after the fact. That has a different impact on the taxpayer. If it's upfront, it's built into the budget drives the mill rate. If it's done after the fact, it does not drive the mill rate because it comes out of excess money that otherwise goes into reserves. So that doesn't drive up taxes. So I would advocate that we think about this in two separate problems and that we keep them distinct, because it's when you blend them together that you get the result that happened at the second committee. And the two issues are, one is, are we going to raise taxes to cover more costs? And I would suggest we not discuss that first. Let's leave that one alone. And the second is, what is a fair approach for appropriately allocating expenses and revenues to a special revenue fund or enterprise fund, whatever you want to call it, and which things belong in there? And I spent some time thinking through my own, like, what is an appropriate unifying theory of what belongs in sort of the general fund versus what belongs in the Simsbury Farms Fund, and how do you make it fair across all kinds of sports? I mean, the soccer players, they pay towards maintenance of the soccer fields, but I don't know if that covers all of it or not. There's, tennis courts. They don't have to pay for tennis in most places other than Simsbury Farms. There's bike trails. Nobody pays to use those. There's parks that people picnic in, but on the other hand, there's the swimming pool, which people do pay for. And so as I sort of tried to think through, well, what are the differences? What are the commonalities between the sports that people pay for and the sports that people don't pay for? And it seems to me that the sports people pay for have ongoing operating costs. You're running the Zamboni machine, you're having lifeguards, you're doing a lot of work on greens maintenance or whatever you call it at a golf course. The softball and soccer have lots of field maintenance, whereas once you build a tennis court, it's kind of there. Once you have the bike path, it's kind of there. And those things are really hard to how would you even charge somebody for the use of those anyway? So there, at least in my mind, there is a sort of division between the sports, and you can fairly allocate one sport to have to break even on its own and the other sport to not. But I think that's something that we should come up with an agreement or kind of a unifying theory of why is it that we treat different sports differently. And then, in my opinion, those high-cost sports ought to be supported by, and I should include summer camps in there, ought to be supported by user fees. But as I think Maria was pointing out, I don't think they have to support capital expenditures, just the ongoing operating costs. I think capital, should come out of taxpayer funds. But that's something we all need to agree on as well. And how do we prevent maintenance from becoming a capital item? Because if you don't do maintenance, all of a sudden you need a capital fix. So, but I think there should be incentives. I think that having a special revenue fund is that it does create an incentive for those programs to be self-sustaining. If you start a summer camp and you don't have enough people signing up to use it, you shouldn't have that summer camp. But if everything is thrown into the general fund, there isn't quite that same level of scrutiny, or there isn't the incentive to do that scrutiny to make sure that things are generally, at least over the course of a few years, paying for themselves. I mean, there's going to be good years and bad years depending upon weather, but you generally, I think, want to see that your operating costs are covered by the user fees. And so that's sort of where I come out on things. I was trying to look for a framework that's fair and that allows us to look at what the allocations ought to be. There's a report that I recommend, if you haven't read it, that I think Jerry and Dave did in October of 2016, that has lots of really good information in there about some of the inconsistencies in how things are allocated within the fund, or across the sports, between general fund and the special revenue fund. And those are all things that I think ought to be fixed, and we ought to make a recommendation about how things are allocated, and then not necessarily be looking to how do we then balance it so that there isn't a tax increase. Because I can tell you as a Board of Finance member, you're going to run into problems this year if you go in and say, hey, we just want to throw all this expense into the general fund and it's going to raise taxes by $500,000 or $1 million or whatever amount you come up with, if there isn't an offsetting, cut somewhere else. And I've always been a huge advocate of the Parks and Rec folks, but it's a tough year in the middle of this epidemic to be going in and, I'm just trying to interject a little reality that so if we can kind of separate those issues and just talk about what seems appropriate and fair and try to then deal with the tax impact later, that we're not necessarily advocating a tax increase.
Yeah.
Can I just comment for 1 second?
Sure.
Linda, thank you. There's never, I've had the good fortune to work for Simsbury since 1999, and there's never a good year for anything, for an increase. I mean, we had over a million plus in new revenue last year from the solar farm, and we had this discussion last year, and look what happens. There's never a good time. And these are like what Sean said before, whether we pay for it on the front or you pay for it on the back, you're still paying, the taxpayers are still paying for it. And we're under, I understand, but okay. So, we could talk about cost recovery for the programs. How far should we go with cost recovery for a day camp or a tennis camp or whatever? Are we just doing it for the contractors and the advertising and the credit card processing fees? Or are we throwing the full salary and benefits and utilities of our building and our programmers into those? I mean, we're not doing that at the library or the senior center where Kathy Marshall and the teen librarians, we're not asking people to come in and take a teen program and pay for the full cost of their supporting costs of those salaries and benefits or the cost to keep the library lights on. But yet we're doing that with the rec department. It just doesn't seem fair. If you're looking at the long-term viability of the rec department, the Parks and Recreation Department as a viable public service with minimum wage increasing and our utility costs increasing, we just can't keep going in the direction we're going. We have to recognize that Simsbury has a rec department and it needs to be supported within the budget that way. And everybody's taking advantage of the not only just the programs but the trails. There is a cost. I mean, as you know, Linda, there's a cost to maintain the trails, the trees, the pavement, the signage, the trash pickups along the trails, the mowing. Everybody, whether it's the tennis court or the trails, there's a cost to everything. And if we're going to be in the business of operating a public pool and a public ice rink, we need to make sure that we can keep it available to the public. If we continue to throw more costs at it and not fix the situation, we're going to price ourselves out, and there's going to be a large segment of our community who won't be able to use those facilities.
Yeah, Tom, and I agree. And again, I'm not proposing this, but if we did nothing but provide the pool, no programs, just the pool, the ice rink, no programs, just the ice rink, and so people swimming and getting passes, people skating around in a circle getting passes, and people playing golf. I assume we have employees and staff to do all the other stuff, right? The rec supervisor has to coordinate all the camp stuff, all the fees, all the people, right? And I'm not suggesting this, but if we didn't have all that extra camps where someone else outside of the town is making money off the town facilities, we wouldn't need those people in their entirety coordinating all that work, right? We wouldn't need as much maintenance. We wouldn't need as much hiring, et cetera. So that's where we need to be careful here. The rec supervisor, Dave, doesn't spend a substantial amount of their time coordinating the dozens of camps and people and getting contractors paid and all that stuff.
Oh, Sean, he absolutely does. But the fact of the matter is, we're back to the philosophical argument of are we a service or are we a revenue generator? Almost all the camps and programs are designed to be a break even. That if they're not going to break even, they don't run them. And that perfect example there, I still recall it was we had a cheer camp and like 5 people signed up for it and the thing was canceled. I think my thing is part of what people move to Simsbury for is not only the complex, it's the events that are run through the complex. It is.
I agree, Dave. I'm not suggesting get rid of them, but go back to the premise of you said it breaks even. There's somebody that gets paid by the town to do all of that coordination, and that's where I debate you that it's not breaking even.
Well, which is why we'd love to see, at least I'm going to kind of, push forward here, that we're providing a service. We're providing a service no different than the library, where they have the reading club and what have you. Those expenses, those administrative expenses of the employee, the benefits and the salary belong in the general fund. Because why? We're providing a service. That contractor, while that contractor may make some money, we're going to charge enough that we're going to be able to offset some of the cost, if not most of it, to the running that program. So, it comes back to what we are unique is we have a golf course. Mm-hmm. So frankly, the pool, the programs, and the rink, in my opinion, per the document, one of the options on the document that was sent out was put those in the general fund. Let the golf course stand alone because it's one of the biggest revenue generators you got. And then let's figure out how to fix that or how to deal with that. But I understand from Linda's standpoint that, gee, to do that, Sean, we know exactly the problem. It was going to cause a change in the mill rate. Well, you know what? It was just as Tom said, it was going to cause a change in the mill rate. Linda, I was on this now. I'm a third timer. So it was 4 years ago, 2 years ago today. I get pandemic. I absolutely get that. I'd like to see this committee basically create a framework that says maybe this isn't the particular year because of the pandemic, but no, we're not putting this out another 2 years. This is going to be, we should come out of this thing saying, here's our fix. We understand that businesses are a whole new mess because of everything, but let's commit to fixing it, because I always thought, and I learned a little bit from talking to Lisa Hebner, one of our biggest problems was every time we asked for money, 180 grand or whatever it is to balance our revenue fund, the auditors hate us because of the fact that it's not a budgeted item. Now, I understand that may have become a budgeted item, but it's time to really just everybody stop messing around. Mm-hmm. Pool, hockey, programs, town service, golf course, revenue generator. Let's let the general fund pay for what it should.
I agree with you, Dave. My only caution, and I gave this to you 2 years ago, is once you're in the general fund and I have to pick between you and police officers, just remember how that works in tough budget years. And that's what happens when you go to the general fund. I'm not saying it's not the wrong thing, but when we have to pick between rec supervisors and police officers, that's the Board of Selectmen is 99% of the time going to prioritize the police department, the plow drivers. And unfortunately, rec will generally, I think, get prioritized further down the list, which is one of the reasons why we've avoided doing this, because we don't want to decimate or have to be in a position where the Board of Finances cut 3% and we have to come and cut. So,
Sean, let me just interject since I've been here for 40 years watching this stuff. Parks and Rec has always been at the bottom of the barrel, and it's first thing that's cut every year. Tom begged for a supervisor or a maintainer this year. Yep. Who was the first thing out of the selectmen's budget to be cut?
Yep.
Tom's maintainer.
Right.
So it's an ongoing tale. And I don't care if throw it in the general fund, you're still going to cut no matter what. And so be it.
Okay.
So that's why I am actually a huge advocate for Tom's budget. But that's why I'm advocating, let's look at what's the right thing to do in terms of allocation, what belongs in a fund, what doesn't, separately from the tax impact. Because the minute you start looking at the tax impact, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Yeah, and then we deal with that in some secondary conversation that will actually fall to some degree or large degree to the Board of Finance. And frankly, and Amy's heard me say this before, the reason this back end stuff doesn't count towards the budgeting is because we do this weird thing of making an assumption about the collection rate and then, we budget less than we actually think we're going to get in revenue, so that there's some leftovers that can be used to do things like put money in reserves or fund things like overages. If we actually looked at that differently and budgeted 100% of the revenue that we think is going to come in, and put a line item in there for this is what we want to go in reserves, you wouldn't have this problem. I mean,
yeah, Linda, if I can just interject.
Back end stuff that we use to subsidize would be the same as the front end. It's because of that weird way that we do things that you have that back end problem, and that somehow that doesn't raise taxes. So that's not really a Parks and Recs problem.
Yeah, Linda, at the back of the packet today is the Parks and Rec analysis of all the parks departments and their revenue funds. And that's one of the things that we wanted to point out is what's the best practices of other towns? What are they doing? And what are they including in their special revenue fund? And they're just not putting full-time employees, their benefits, as well as a lot of the building maintenance in their revenue fund. Those are all outside and they are general fund expenses, and that's where they belong.
So West Hartford does 10% of their director, 25% of their leisure services manager, which sounds like a rec coordinator, 33% of their admin, 10% of their maintenance manager, 40% of their ground maintenance, for 2 full-time staff for the skating rink, and 5 golf staff.
That's changed since 2019, Sean, when that was published, because West Hartford went to an enterprise fund for their leisure, what they call their leisure fund,
okay,
which incorporates all of their parks and recreation.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. And my only point earlier is we did nothing last time because we were asked to recommend or not recommend an enterprise fund, and we decided not to recommend an enterprise fund. So us doing nothing was actually doing something.
So can I suggest we have a series of decisions to talk through, and that us as a group of people who haven't, well, some of you have, but I certainly haven't got all the data on all of the numbers. I would like to see somebody who comes in and does, what used to be called time and motion studies, or something to do an appropriate allocation of the various employees' time. I don't think we can just randomly say, well, it's 30% or it's 10%. I mean, Tom's folks would know better based on what they actually do. But to me, the bigger questions that we can answer are which sports belong in the fund, operating costs versus capital. I think that's a fairly easy one. I think we'd all agree on that. And which, if they're in the fund, user fees paying for them.
Maria, could you share that pyramid that is in the Parks and Open Space Master Plan that our consultant produced within that report? And it deals with what the taxpayers or the general fund should be looking at paying versus the users paying?
I don't know if I have that handy, but just sort of a general thought, and perhaps, Sean, if it's okay for us to screen share the report again and maybe show some of the possible options that we at staff level had proposed for the cost allocation piece.
Yeah.
I had done some cost recovery work early on in my career when I was a budget analyst in Savannah. And, there really are a lot of different approaches that we could take to doing it. One of the challenges I would say is that, we're not a large city. We don't have just oodles and oodles of accountants, and all they do is, just accounting work and looking at interfund transfers and tracking, costs. And there are more simple methods in terms of cost recovery and approaches that we could take. And so again, at a staff level, when we, sort of based on our collective experience and looking at what might be some more simplistic ways of getting the job done, in the report, we had suggested maybe at least as a starting point, considering a few of these options. And one which would
Maria, before we get into that though, can we just take a pause? So Linda, I agree with your work items, but I think we need to go up a level. And Melissa, can you just roll up to the recommendations? I don't think we have consensus yet on what are we doing overall? Because if we decide to go all general fund, it's a different exercise than if we decide to go all revenue fund, than if we decide to go general fund with golf fund. So I do want to get into all the analysis, Maria, and I'm sorry for interrupting about all of that, but we still need to answer the which way are we going question first, because the allocations and the work is different underneath each one of those. Right?
Right. You don't have to worry about allocation at all if you go all general fund.
Correct. But then we do need a way for us to budget the revenue to show you, because it's, I mean, as we showed you 2 years ago and nobody liked it, you know, there was what was it, the $2 million increase in the Board of Selectmen budget. And then the offsets are on, you know, page 947 of the budget book in the revenue item. And it's not an easy conversation to have, even with all of us that are involved in this, let alone explaining it to the taxpayers.
No, right? And Sean, I agree with your approach from a standpoint of, so I'm just going to jump forward and say, look, from the perspective of what everyone said at Park and Rec, all expenses accounted in for the general fund, we're not asking for that. All expenses to be done in the special revenue fund, we already know that doesn't work. So the most realistic one to be discussed is all expenses accounted for in the general fund with the exception of the golf course. So I think I agree with you. I think let's get the model first identified, and then we can get into the weeds as to what those allocations may be. But we really didn't, at Park and Rec, we didn't feel that either the first or the second option was either fair to the town or fair to the special revenue fund.
All right. Art, you haven't had a chance to weigh in on this party. Any thoughts from your vantage point?
No, I'm beginning to wonder why I volunteered for all this. No, I mean,
embrace it, my friend. We're a good group.
Yeah, I know you're a good group, and you're taking it seriously, and it's a steep learning curve. So, you know, one of the tips on living is save your comments until you know more about what you're talking about. So keep going. I'm listening.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you weren't getting shut out from the discussion.
No, I'm not shut out. I will wave hands and barge in, but there's a history. I mean, not only is this a financial problem, there's a history to it, and then you know there's the current reality of this year. So I can see where it's complicated. Keep going.
Okay. So again, I'm all for, Maria. How do you think we ought to structure this decision? I mean, again, you know, I don't want to sit here and vote or otherwise, but I mean, I'm in agreement with what what David just said, that, you know, we've seen that the special revenue fund really doesn't work. And again, the world's going to change underneath us. The 70%, if we pick 70% or 60%, that's going to work for a couple of years. $92,000 is going to work for a couple of years. And then we're probably going to be back here again if we keep trying.
I don't want to come back again.
I know, neither do I, around the edges, right? And then the general fund seems to be the simplest answer, but there's just a really big pie chart and a bunch of explanations and a beating that I'm going to take in a meeting in February trying to explain it, which is fine.
I'll buy you coffee.
Yeah, Red Bull, please. But the third option is really interesting to me, because again, we've kind of got the makings of that, and you know, we've already got the CNR spiked out for the golfers. It's a little easier to define who works in the pro shop and doesn't double their time anywhere else, who cuts the grass at the golf course versus who takes trees down across town at Weetalk Park.
That is the only part of the revenue fund that is completely separate.
And the only reason I suggest that is again, then we've always talked about the golf course does generally end up at positive revenue. Now, what I don't want to run into is then, okay, well, that money only gets used for the golf course or otherwise. Maybe that's the right answer, maybe it's not. And I don't want to get bogged down with that right now, but that will lead to the discussion. But do folks agree that at least sounds like a cleaner method to do it if we're going to not dump it all in the general fund, or how are folks feeling about that?
I'm not all that comfortable with that. I mean, I don't care if golf is in its own fund, but I also think that the pool, the ice rink, and the summer camps all ought to be expected to live on user fees for covering their operational expenses. But it ought to be fair operational expenses, not stuff that's loaded in there that has nothing to do with them. And that's where we get to the allocation issue.
So
Yeah,
you're more of keeping the special revenue fund at this point, Linda, and going through the exercise of what the allocations.
Yeah, it gives you a closer scrutiny of, are these things actually paying for themselves or not? If it's buried in the general fund, that's going to be very hard to find.
Okay. Chris or others?
This is a tangent that I'm trying to, I should have listened to Art a long time ago. I rarely practice that mantra, but my concern here is what I believe is going unsaid, which is this seemingly always devolves into something about, do we have a golf course or not? And that is not something so I fear that this will always be something that always seemingly has a target on its back. And will we do the golf course a disservice by handicapping, no pun intended, Dave and Jerry, handicapping its operations, or set it on a path for more difficult budgetary discussions by doing whatever we're doing? Because there always seems to be a group that comes out with that as the intention around these discussions, either defending the golf course's existence or trying to do away with the golf course. So I'm just going to kind of put that out there, because that conversation takes place privately quite often amongst members of this team and outside as well. So I don't know what I just said, but it seems like that is a concern. That's the concern of mine.
Chris, I think the rationale for people wanting to get rid of the golf course, there's been one person constantly saying the golf course loses money, which is not a fact. And Amy was kind enough to send me a historical profit and loss statement years ago for the golf course. It does make money for the town. There's been a couple of years where it had a slight deficit. That was basically weather related, but on the whole, the golf course is a profit center for the town.
Yeah. And one of Chris, the way I would respond to your question is that if the golf course was isolated in a fund, I think it would be a lot easier to be transparent with the taxpayers to say, look, there's no, provided this was true of how we set it up, there's no output from the town general fund to the golf course. Here are the employees, here are the salaries, these are all golf related, here are the revenues associated with it, and then people can make their own decision or not. But again, at least in my mind, the way I would set it up is the only connection to the town is the capital.
Correct.
And that's existed. And, you know, as Linda said, I agree with what she said. I think we all agree that, you know, the capital makes sense and it isn't really necessarily intertwined in this discussion. And furthermore, we charge the users $1 per 9, right, Jerry? So
it's $1 per 9 or $100 on a season pass.
Right. So that goes into Amy keeps track of that, right? And that goes towards,
yes, she does.
You know, minor,
and it's been successful.
Right. It has been. So I think if we are interested in spiking something out, the golf course is set up nicely for it. And Chris, not interested in putting it on an island to then turn around and go sell it. That's not what I'm looking at to do here. But just from
you have a lot of buyers.
Yeah, you know, and maybe we'll get to that point somewhere down the road. I don't know, but you know, at this point in time, I think things have stabilized, and we don't need to explore that. You know, as our competitors have gone out of business, and that course looks damn good.
Yeah, got it.
Can I address Linda's concern?
Sure.
So, Linda, that you have been an ardent supporter of Park and Rec, and I thank you for that. I think, and Tom, if you need to, you can pipe in, but our difficulty is if we were to take capital out of it, if we were to try to run that pool and charge folks the amount of money that we're spending operationally, staff, utilities, you know, things of that nature, the amount of money that we're going to need to charge for a season pass or an individual.
Tom would be swimming by himself.
Yeah, it's going to become burdensome. So Tom, is there any, maybe more detail that you could just help the committee have, which is, look at, I like the revenue fund, but I think reality is with wage increases that are going to be mandated and other expenditures, again, not capital, are we going to be able to operate that pool where we charge somebody, what we're charging them now?
No, it's going to become much more difficult as we approach the minimum wage at 15. And that's kind of what I was saying before. If the town wants to have an aquatics facility, the general fund needs to support it to some extent. And I'm not asking the taxpayers to pay for lifeguards. What I'm asking to pay is the general upkeep of the pool, the utilities, our water bill. What we should be asking our season pass holders and our daily admission people to pay for are first aid materials, registration related costs, credit card processing costs, staff time to do the deposits, and the cost of the lifeguards. They should not be paying for the water and the electricity. They wouldn't walk into the library to get a book and pay for that. And we're going to charge them a cost of cleaning the rugs or emptying the trash or having the lights or the air conditioning turned on. We wouldn't do that. Just like we don't charge, we're not charging Little League and we're not charging Simsbury Soccer Club a direct cost for mowing the grass. What they are paying is a $10 per participant season charge that goes toward lining materials, maybe get extra grass seed. If we were to charge them for the full cost of the hourly man hours put into any of those fields, whether it's Memorial Park or Curtis Park, you're going to be passing a significant cost onto those organizations, and they're going to be flooding Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen meetings, wondering why their user fees have gone from X to 5 times X, because that's what would happen if the town's maintaining these fields as a public service. This is what we're asking for the rink in the pool to be as well, to be recognized as a public service. And again, if they're choosing to use take a swim lesson, for instance, then they should be charged the hourly fee for the staff time that went into producing that swim lesson, the lifeguard charge, the registration fee, that kind of thing. We're not asking for anybody to say the pool's open for free and the cost is passed on to the taxpayers. What we're asking for is the basic underlying maintenance charges to be covered for the Simsbury Farms main building, the rink and the pool, and everything else. People would pay the cost, just like a day camp cost. If the day camp cost is $100 for fees and arts and crafts supplies and transportation, then we should make $100. We should be charging $100 plus a little bit more, but we shouldn't be charging $100 plus a little bit more plus the cost of the rec programmer who set up the program and the cost of the toilet paper at Simsbury Farms. That's not fair to a kid taking a camp over at Wheat Dog Park or Central School. And I'm sorry, that's a lot to say in a minute or two.
I think that's the crux of what I was trying to get at in my own head was, what's the unifying rule or theory that applies to all things? When you're talking about the library, I think that there's state law that applies to the library and not to other things. But I struggled with, what's fairly considered appropriate to be included in the user fee and what isn't. And I think you make, compelling points there. I think the thing is that, for me at least, and this is gut as opposed to, perfect rational thinking, that I think that a lot of people would see a library or softball, maybe kids soccer as things that pretty much every town does. But when you start talking about having an ice rink and a pool and a golf course, those seem like extras. Those are sort of like unbelievably wonderful things that not every town has, but that a lot of people don't avail themselves of, and they resent, feeling like that, well, why is my tax dollar paying for that? So to the degree that we can say to them, the users are paying for, the operating costs, that's where I was coming from. But yeah, you make a good point about how do you even define the operating costs.
Yeah, so I would argue, Linda, when the town in 1972 built this complex, bought the land and built this project up here at Simsbury Farms, all the taxpayers shared the burden of it, and it helped the value of everybody's property, and it continues to help the value of everybody's property. So, whether they use the facility or not, a quality, well-maintained facility up here benefits everybody in town.
Yeah, and even when the golf course is closed, how many people are out there walking their dogs?
Walking the trails,
or
exactly.
When it snows, it now becomes a cross-country venue, and the ninth hole becomes a ski hill or a sled hill.
Flooding,
And
yeah.
I think from a data standpoint is, again, what Maria and her staff put together in this little package in the Appendix A, survey of towns with revenue funds, I think is enlightening from a standpoint of we are clearly in the minority of how we operate. So again, I think the first thing we have to do, as Sean suggested, was let's figure out what model we're following. Once we have the model, we actually have quite a bit of good data right here about all of our other local towns. The fact is that a lot of them do 100%, some maybe do 70%, but we have to get back to great. All right, we have a pool, we have an ice rink, we have paddle tennis, we have tennis. You know what? And we have programs. Almost every other town around us treats that as a service, and so therefore the administrative expenses are put into the general fund. I think out of this meeting today, if we reach an agreement on that concept, then we can move forward with, all right, what's the allocation? And that's maybe just all of us spending a little more time in the data points and then having an opinion about where we should go.
Can I ask a quick question? Does the Parks and Rec Commission have authority to set the user fees, or does that have to go to the Board of Selectmen?
Always the Board of Selectmen. All we are is an advisory committee.
One thing I was reading, and it was from another state, recommended that those fees be set by not the Board of Selectmen, but by a commission, so that it was a little less political and clearly based on costs. You know.
And Linda, I've been doing this just like you have for way, way, way too long. We've been fortunate that we have rarely had the Board of Selectmen question how the rates that we've come up with, because way back in the day, we had Tom West doing his analysis. We now have the Jerry Wetchins of the world who do a lot of the analysis. That I think generally we know what the rate should be based on things that both Jerry Toner and now Tom Taberski, they check with all the other local towns. We have a spreadsheet that we get and we use that. So I think the Board of Selectmen has been great. They've really respected the fact that we've done the legwork.
And you guys have done an outstanding job, as you just articulated, because, you know, Jerry and now Tom comes in and, you know, there's a whole huge chart, Linda, on what are the averages for pool rates? Why are we going up $1 here on a golf rate and down 50 cents over here? New ideas. We brought in the specials. There's been a substantial amount of vetting that these guys do. And then a couple of years ago on iteration number 1 of this group did send Jerry Toner back to go review those rates again with Parks and Rec and the expense side. Because when we agreed to move more money over and take an allocation in the Board of Selectmen budget, the counterpoint was we wanted to make sure that all stones had been overturned on the Parks and Rec side, and that we were coming together on there. And these guys, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, and Bill, Dave, but I think Jerry came up with 75,000 in expense savings and another 30 or 40 in revenue.
You are correct.
When he went and dug deep. So.
Yep. Agreed.
Okay.
So when talking about putting stuff in the general fund, you're not talking about put aside for a moment that funding that comes as a last minute, end of the year bailout technically doesn't go into the mill rate calculation. Let's assume for a moment that it did. We're not talking about increasing the overall budget plus that extra, but rather just moving it around, right?
It's just a different source of money.
Well, and Linda, I think I would think the easier way to answer it is we're trying to undo something that a prior administration had done, which went totally against almost at the time every other revenue fund in the state. So we're simply trying to level the playing field where somebody didn't want a mill rate. They made some changes to avoid that mill rate increase. And now it's, you know, we're back trying to fix a problem that none of us here on the call created.
Yeah, it's righting a wrong, a 15 or almost a 20-year-old wrong.
Your expenses are going to be the same regardless of how this works out.
Correct.
Right, Tom? So you're not actually increasing your expenses as a result. It's just how it's allocated.
Yeah, I would even argue that there may be an extra bump in revenue from program fees as fees are lowered and made available to more individuals. You see more people in the programs, and that would generate more revenue.
Sounds like a laugher curve to me, which is
So the only caution though, Linda, is, and again, I agree with where you're going with that, and I agree with everything that Tom just responded with, but when we add it up and when we present it to you like we did 2 years ago, you're going to have a lot of questions, because again, this is going to show what, and again, I'm not advocating against it. I'm actually for this. I believe you're going to show a $2 million plus increase.
Come a long way, Sean.
You're wearing me down, Jerry. You're gonna see a $2 million increase in the Board of Selectmen budget, and then again on page 962 of the budget book, I'm going to show you offsetting revenues that don't offset the entire increase, and there is going to have to be somewhere in the budget either an offsetting cut or a mill rate increase to pay for that. And again, it's not perfect because we're still subject to weather, so we're still going to get to the end of the year and there's going to have to be an accounting of how close did we get. The difference is the general fund's just going to pick it up at a year-end transfer, not as a special transfer, right, Amy? You're on
Fund balance and whatever surplus or.
Say it again.
So if it was in the general fund, it would just go into the fund balance and contribute to whatever surplus or deficit we have. The general fund made $100,000 and Parks and Rec was $50,000, then it would be $150,000 contribution into the fund balance. But if we had $100,000 with the regular general fund and say $50,000 loss with Parks and Rec, then now your surplus is only $50,000. So we can do reporting to see how it breaks out between Parks and Rec and the rest of the general fund, but it just becomes all culminated together.
Yeah. So said another way, Linda, from my perspective, when the 900,000 or the million from the collection rate goes into the general fund, right? And if we didn't change that, that gets washed in with the loss of the gain here.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I'm saying, and I don't know if Amy's cringing or not, but it's a huge philosophical change to say let's stop with the assumption of we're not going to collect 99.5, even though we have collected 99.5% of the taxes every single year, or never less than that. Let's assume a different thing and then make a budgeted amount that we want to put into reserves that we'll aim for. But the reality is we're spending this money in the end. It's a shell game.
Absolutely.
It seems to me we sort of back into it. So if we're really not talking about increasing expenses, we ought to be able to figure out a way to accommodate this. And I'm not articulating it as clearly as it could be.
No, I know what you mean.
Right.
The only reason I'll push back on the shell game is because it's forced savings that's not available for anybody to spend at this point. Yep. Once you budget for it, it becomes available to spend.
Because we're pretending that the Parks and Rec department is going to live within a budget that we know they're not going to live within.
Right.
And at the end of the year, we end up giving them extra money. So why don't we just, deal with it in a more upfront way?
Yeah, and I mean, again, that's what we're here for, regardless of the collection rate. So,
and we have funds in reserves right now anyway, more than I'd like to have there, quite frankly.
I agree, and we got this $2 million piece of land we'd love to buy with it.
So that's a different matter.
So again, Linda, it sounds like, I mean, again, to eliminate. Sorry, go ahead. To eliminate the ambiguity, I mean, it's either it all goes into the general fund or it goes into the general fund and we spike out the golf course, right? If we keep it in the special revenue fund, there's always, no matter how hard we work, no matter how smart we are not going to get the number right because of the variability in the weather and play and all the other factors. So there will always be a need to transfer or build up funds. We just never paid attention before because the fund was always building, right? As soon as it started going the other way, then we all started paying attention. So if we want to eliminate the building or the receipting of the fund, the only two options are general fund or general fund with golf course, right?
We wouldn't be sitting here today talking about this if the fund were allowed to build up over the years with just the golf course. It's the profits from from 30 years of golf, or almost 50 years of golf have disappeared because they were brought back into the general fund, or I'm sorry, well, at the beginning, the first 30 years put back into the general fund, and then the last 20 years gone to subsidize the salaries and benefits and underlying issues with the pool and the rink and what other rec programs. It was subsidizing the other parts of the fund for the last 20 years, 18 of the 20 years. I apologize.
And that's why I raised that question before about, we're not talking about actually increasing total expenses. And my concern is if we say, well, the golf gets to be in its own fund and keep its excess, its surplus revenue at the end of the year if you have it, that's always been used to subsidize the other sports, or not always, but for 20 years, if you're accurate about that. And so if we say that money can stay in the golf fund, then you actually are increasing expenses, because that money for the pool and the hockey rink and stuff need to come from somewhere, and
that's not necessarily so, Linda, because if the golf course builds up a surplus, then the golf course wouldn't necessarily come back to the town for capital expenditures.
Well, I thought we agreed.
I think in a short year, that built up fund would help in the short years.
Correct.
Like that's what would have happened the last 20 years. If the profits had stayed with the golf course, we'd have, I don't know, Jerry could probably recite the exact number, but I'm guessing it's north of $1 million in surplus that would have been used to subsidize the 2 short years.
It's close to $16 million over the 50 years.
But then you're building up. This is one thing that I don't like when I see it on the Board of Finance, is having everybody has their own special reserves.
Yep.
Because when the rating agencies are looking at a town, they're looking just at our, what's in our general fund reserves, and that's what they rate us. If the Board of Ed and the Special Revenue Fund for Simsbury Farms and the library and everybody else has their own little, slush fund, that's what we have a general fund for.
But Linda, if the golf course were to remain, let's say, be the remaining portion of the revenue fund, there's nothing that stops the Board of Finance or the Board of Selectmen from taking those funds back.
Correct. I mean, the golf course would, Amy, what's the number on the golf course this past fiscal year? 200,000?
I don't know offhand. I can look it up quick.
Well, you had an increase in revenue of 197,000.
Yeah.
Right. So an increase of 197. The golf course would have generated a profit this year that would, say it rains next year, the year after, it would be able to absorb that bad year. That any profit the golf course generated this year is gone because of the effect that COVID-19 had on the ice rink and the pools this past year, and the lack of us being able to do any programs this past spring, and severely mitigating it our registrations during the spring period. So that's the problem, is that it's taking the hit for the other parts of the operation. The golf course stays alone and you let that build up. And again, like Jerry said, at any point the Board of Selectmen could tap that fund for put some money toward, if they think it's too much money, put it toward the irrigation project or whatever. They can do that, but it would negate the golf course having to come back and ask for 100,000 to cover the loss, or 10,000 like it did last year to cover the loss on the golf course.
But to the extent that you're letting it build up in the golf special revenue fund, then the subsidy that used to come to the other things will be a new expense that will have to be covered.
Unless the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance want to take it to cover it.
Yeah, it's an accounting, Linda, for how do we want to do it. You're right. If we left the golf course on its own and we left the money in there and we didn't budget for that transferring over, we didn't assume that was transferring over, you're right, that we would have to either let it run a deficit and it would reduce the amount we transferred to reserves, or we budget for it and tax people for it.
But then at the same time, Linda, that's the whole idea, again, of this analysis of the other towns. The best practices is that we are right now an outlier. We are not using the best practices. It is recognized the operation of a pool, the operation of a tennis court is a service to the town, not a revenue generating one. So the idea that, yep, maybe the golf course has a couple of bucks sitting over here. We are unique in the opportunity that we have a golf course that has a couple bucks sitting over here. Everyone else looks at, or not everyone, but clearly the 75 to 80%, it's looked at as this is a service. It is a taxpayer subsidized service. We just happen to have this other little entity called a golf course that, you know, we should treat differently than we do. Let's take all the things that are common in the towns. Let's treat them the same and put them in the general fund. That's all we're looking to do.
Yeah.
And Sean, part of the reason I always talked about the golf course being an enterprise fund was preclude the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen from grabbing that any excess monies.
Oh, I know. And you wanted to go float bonds, which is why we killed it. Yeah, I know.
No, you could.
If you're precluding us from using that subsidy, then you're really adding to the tax bill. And I mean, I'm sorry, but the job of the Board of Finance is in part to protect the taxpayers. And when you start comparing us to other towns, I agree with everything you've said, Dave, about how we don't compare well on Parks and Rec, but we also don't compare well on our tax rate. We tax higher than other towns for the same size, same cost house.
And basically that's an internal problem within your own board.
Pardon?
That's a problem within your own board to make that decision.
No, that's a problem with our town's expenditures in total. I mean, if you're going to spend the money in total, then the taxes have to cover it. So somewhere there has to be some savings. I mean, you know.
Linda,
so guys, we can go on all night on this, and I think it's a really, really good discussion. But we're at an hour 15 here. What I'd like to do is we've had a really good, I think, history lesson here, which I think is important. We've gotten some really good input. We have, I think, a thoughtful analysis in front of us. What I would ask is that the two Board of Finance members, the two Board of Select members, the two Culture Parks and Rec members take away and continue to put some thoughts around, is it option A? Is it option B? Is it option C? Meaning, or is there a fourth option? Yep. And if you're going to have a fourth option, I would really encourage that to get emailed to the group for thought ahead of time. Because what I want to do is set another meeting and come back, and we need to philosophically decide which of these three directions we're going to go, because otherwise these are really good discussion, but we'll not be able to get off this point and go down one of the roads, because there's a lot of work here depending on which one we pick for how's the accounting work. And again, Linda, it's a very important question. Do we sweep the fund? Do we not? You know, those are all really important questions that do need to get answered once we decide directionally. And again, if it all falls apart, we can certainly come back. But I would like us to gain some consensus at our next meeting on which of the 3 or 3.5 options we have, so that we can start putting some time into what does that accounting look like? What does the budgeting look like? What are the communications and messaging? Because again, it's not a simple process, as those of you that remember from the Board of Finance meeting a couple of years ago, when we just went general fund. You know, it's a deep discussion on how does everything line up and making sure that this group is comfortable with whatever we come out with, because it does need to get recommended back to our boards, right?
Would it be helpful if Amy were able to put together the numbers under the 3 options?
Yeah. So I don't want her to do that, only because it's a massive amount of work, Jerry.
Yeah.
And it all comes to the same conclusion, right? It's just a matter of how's it presented. So I really think we ought to decide as the policymakers that Maria asked us, you know, early on here, of policy wise, philosophically wise, how do we want to account for this? It's all the same money. It's all the same expenses. It's just how do we show it to the taxpayers? And do we tax them up front for it, or do we fill in the hole afterwards? Do we have some combination of both? But that's really what we're driving at here.
And I actually think, Sean, it's a decision between the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance members, because I know where Dave and I are coming from.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to weigh in their perspective. But yep.
But this is the same discussion. We go back to 2014.
Yep. So Jerry, trying to, again, as much as I love meeting with you, buddy, trying to have this be one of the last times we get this group together. Third time's the charm. So if you guys will indulge
That
me
would
in
make my day.
anything I just said made sense, we can put some more thought into it. And can the 6 of us come back in, we'll say, 14 days, 16 days, whatever, get another meeting on the calendar and coalesce around one of the options?
Sounds like a plan.
Art,
What by me?
Sean, could I just ask a mechanical question?
Yes, sir.
Of the 3 we have there, let's just, for instance, suppose you took the third, all expenses to be accounted for in the general fund with the exception of the golf course. Now, what does to be accounted for in that sense mean? Fees would be collected and the gap between the fees and the necessary expenses would come from the general fund? Is that what that means?
So
Yes.
essentially, yes, it's in a think about your budget book. You would show the Culture, Parks and Rec budget with a $2 million increase in expenditures, and it would be all the salaries, et cetera. And then at the end of the budget book with all the revenues, you would see new revenues there for the user fees, the camps, et cetera. So they would be divorced from each other versus the revenue fund, which is all tied up together now.
Thank you. Okay.
Right, Amy?
Right.
I said all that, but Amy's the one that knows how that works. It's a matter of how we're presenting this. It's really, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's how in the budget book are we going to show everybody this? And then how in the financials does it get shown? Right. And then once we get into it, we can fight about allocations and everything else, how it looks. But at the end of the day, as Tom said, it's the same expenditures. It's just how are we paying for them and at what timing and at what cadence.
Line item do they show up in?
Yep. So, all right. So that's fair. We have some homework here. I'll work with staff to get another date here.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you all.
October 11th.
Time.
Appreciate everybody's thoughts. This is good stuff. Maria, go ahead. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry about that, Linda. It's okay. Sorry about that, Linda. I know you're going to be doing some traveling. Were you just sharing which dates you're not available?
I leave October 11th,
Okay. And then when would you be back?
just before Thanksgiving.
Oh, that sounds like a nice trip. But okay, that's a long stretch.
They're out RVing again.
Okay. Got
Just needs a good internet connection from that RV.
That's the problem, is campgrounds don't have good internet connections.
I can point you to some.
So again, read through the report that staff put together. The recommendations are there and the options. And again, if there's something that you're missing or something that you need, again, very well done. I think it's all encompassing. But if there's something that you're not seeing there, let's get that request in. But hopefully this will help us again move forward next time, and we'll go from there. Chris, that work for you as well, buddy? Saw your lips moving. It looks like a yes.
I said, I'm sorry, I can't wait.
There you go. I think that sums it up.
Oh, my friends, I enjoy all of you very much. Smart people solving complex problems. All right, we'll table the update on the Parks and Rec master plan for now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We've got our next steps. Because this is a special meeting, there is no more business before us.
I thought there was an update on the master plan.
Yeah.
Parks and Rec.
So I moved to table it. I'll need a second.
Okay.
Second.
Is there discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. We'll bring that up at a later point.
Okay.
All right, we did our next steps. So thank you all very much. I need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you guys. Have a great
Thanks,
evening.
Sean.
Appreciate all your time. Amy, Maria, Tom, thanks.